Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and you're very welcome to this evening's seminar and Q&A on the topic of the social power of language. I'm James McCarthy and I'm your host for this evening. Normally I would begin by informing you of the house rules, but as this is a virtual event, I'm sure that you'll be well aware of the location of the fire exits within your home in the unlikely event that your smoke alarm should sound. So, without further ado, I invite you to sit back, relax, and most importantly, engage with this discussion on the social power of language.
When we use language to communicate, we make choices. We choose not just what we want to say, but also, importantly, how we want to say it. I can greet you with a
"Good morning,"
or with a
"Here comes trouble."
Both are ways of saying hello, but I'm much more likely to use the first with colleagues or strangers and the second with friends.
And it's not just that we make different choices in different contexts. Those choices matter, because how I choose to greet you tells you something of how I relate to you and how I understand our relationship. And that means that I can potentially use it to influence or even change our relationship.
A classic social science experiment that illustrates this idea is the breaching experiment. In the breaching experiment, you make unexpected choices and see what happens.
Our students do this thing called a breaching experiment, and an example of a breaching experiment would be the student going to their parents and using much more formal language choices than they normally would. Now, this is a relatively trivial example, but the parents' reactions show the social impact that our language choices can potentially have. Because the parents don't just think that the student is acting strangely, typically they laugh. And then they say something like either,
"What have you done?"
or,
"What do you want?"
In other words, they try to make sense of these unexpected language choices.
So, the way that we talk matters, because language doesn't just reflect the social context. There is a sense in which it creates or constructs the social context.
We are Cards at Ulster. We are a group of researchers who study language using an approach called conversation analysis.
As you'll see from the examples that we're going to show you, we each apply the approach to very different settings. But before we get to those different settings, Samantha's going to tell you about how we work with spoken language data.
We study language choices using a scientific approach called conversation analysis. We investigate why speakers said that particular thing in that particular moment and what that tells us about what they're doing. We look at everything someone says, how the other person responded to them, and what that response tells us about how they understood what the first person is doing. So, how do we do that? Well, first we start with recordings of real life, and then we transcribe them. These real life settings can be in person, on the phone, or online. Whatever the context, the key is that these conversations are natural and are not scripted or role-played. This is because we're interested in how people talk to each other in real life contexts. When people have a conversation, they design their responses based on what the previous speaker said. Because of this, we argue that the best way to study how people talk to each other is to look at real life contexts. We don't do experiments because then the conversation would not be natural and would not accurately reflect how people talk to each other in the real world. Therefore, to understand social power, we look at recordings of real life and analyse how people use their language to influence and shape their relationships to one another in context. We look for patterns in how people talk to each other and begin to work out what those patterns tell us about the effects of our communication choices in that setting. So, without further ado, let's take a look at some of the ways we've identified how people use or construct their social power.
The World Health Organization has found that half of all mental health conditions start by the age of 14. And one piece of advice we regularly hear is to connect and communicate. But this can be incredibly difficult for both teenagers and their parents, as many struggle in their day-to-day interactions, seeming to always be at odds with one another. My research examines the language choices that can cause communication breakdown between teenagers and their parents. I've identified a common theme across a number of these family interactions. Authority. I found that parents and teenagers see power and authority very differently. Parents express their identity as parents by invoking the authority that stems from their parental rights and obligations. Parents regularly do things in talk to assert their authority by demonstrating their social rights and obligations to parent their teenagers. And one of the things that they can do is make a threat. Here we have an instance where a mum is monitoring her 14-year-old daughter Melissa as she's doing her homework. And the mum says that she'll check on her again and begins to issue a threat. So threats can typically have an if-then structure. So if the recipient continues the problem action, then there'll be negative consequences affected by the speaker. So typically threats have two main responses: compliance, to stop the problem action, or defiance, to continue or even exaggerate the problem. Here, Melissa is able to recognise Mum's turn as a threat based on its linguistic structure, and following just the first component, she halts the threat before its completion. Melissa doesn't defy this threat. Instead, before her mother completes the turn, Melissa resists the conditions of the threat before the consequence can be issued. She does this by demonstrating that when it comes to schoolwork, she knows more than her mother. By demonstrating this knowledge, she presents herself not as a daughter or as a child, but as a student. In the conversations I've studied, this pattern regularly occurs. Teenagers use knowledge to do resistance. Parents do things in talk that assert their authority as parents with the rights to influence their teenage children's behaviour. But teenagers do not see authority this way. Instead, they assert their autonomy by deploying knowledge as a competing form of authority to actively resist their parents. For teenagers, knowledge is power. They use their independent knowledge to assert their autonomy and identifies other categories besides being a child, such as being a friend or an expert in some other field, whether this is a hobby, sport, or schoolwork. My research shows very precisely how conversations like these can quickly break down, and provides important insights into how parents can adapt their communication to avoid undermining their own parental authority while supporting their teenagers' growing autonomy. By analysing linguistic structure and action formation of individual turns, and the organisation of the sequence and the context of the whole interaction, we can see how social power is claimed and resisted by parents and teenagers, and we can also see the significance of our language choices in our everyday lives.
How can we use the social power of language to target sexist behaviour? And what does the word mansplaining actually mean? Now, in this video, I'll be talking about some of the research that my colleagues and I have done on the word mansplaining. But before I get to that, let's talk a little bit about sexism. Now, sexism can take a lot of different forms, and some of those forms are really explicit, such as gendered advertisements where a woman is seen to be advertising a cleaning product, or institutionalised sexism where a highly qualified woman gets passed over for a managerial position in favour of a lesser qualified man. Now, these forms of sexism are quite observable and thus more easily called out. But what about the more covert and hidden forms of sexism? And this is where mansplaining comes in. Now, to give some background on the term mansplaining, it's been around for about a decade, and it came about on social media as social media users responded to a blog post that Rebecca Solnit wrote, recounting an experience she had when a guy came over to her at a party, describing the book that she herself wrote. And it gets used in pop culture, so here Dua Lipa references mansplaining sarcastically.
I'm sure if there's something that I can't find the words to say, I know that there will be a man around to save the day. And that was sarcasm in case you needed it mansplained.
So there is clearly a widespread consensus that mansplaining is a real phenomenon that women face. But there isn't really a widespread definition that everybody agrees on, so it's quite controversial as to what was or what was not mansplaining. Now, the canonical dictionary definition of mansplaining goes something like a man explaining something to a woman in a patronising or condescending way. But there are also bits and pieces of that definition, such as a man interrupting a woman, a man dominating the conversation, for instance. So where do all these pieces fit in, and how do people actually use mansplaining? Now, in our research, we looked at real-life clips, and in these clips, we see the term get used by a speaker, so how the term mansplaining gets used by a woman to accuse a man of some sexist behaviour. kind of like in this example from the BBC.
What Barry forgets is what we're actually negotiating now is the withdrawal agreement. Which is
No, sorry, that's not true. That's not true, because what we're actually doing
please
is
let me finish, Barry.
have to bring back to Parliament.
Stop mansplaining. I know what they're doing because I go to Cabinet.
So we can see here that Claire uses the word mansplaining to target something that Barry has done in the interaction she is having with him. But what exactly has he done to cause her to use the word mansplaining? And this is where our research comes in. So my colleagues and I went out to investigate real-life uses of the word mansplaining. And we found 3 ways that the term gets used by women against men. And the first way that we found exposed a man's patronising conduct. And this aligns with the dictionary definition of mansplaining in that it's used to sanction a man for he has claimed to know more than a woman on the matters at hand, despite having equal access to the information. And the second way we found was around gender knowledge. And in our data, this regarded reproductive healthcare. And here the term gets leveraged against a man, for he shouldn't be telling a woman what to do with their body. And the third way that we found was to silence a man. Now here the term gets used against a man, and it disrupts the entire conversation, and it undermines the credibility of what the man has been saying. So it focuses all of the attention from all of the people in the conversation on this transgression that is apparently sexist. So what does this all mean? Well, we identified those 3 ways that the term mansplaining gets used in real-life conversation. And although one of those ways aligned with the dictionary definition, we found 2 new ways that are grounded in real-life uses of the term mansplaining. And this adds to how we understand and what we know about sexist behaviour and how to call it out. Now, the term mansplaining is really neat because not only does it push back and target sexist behaviour, but it makes the transgression, the sexist behaviour, a bigger deal. It makes it known to all of the people in that conversation. And this is really important because it highlights the social power of language in that we can transform previously unspeakable acts into talkable things by formulating the sexist behaviour in a really neat term like mansplaining. It allows the person that is accusing someone of mansplaining to very precisely target that sexist behaviour. And that's what we found with the term mansplaining. Now, if you want to know more about mansplaining, we've written a blog for Slugger O'Toole as part of the ESRC festival. And you can also read our upcoming paper in the Journal of Feminism and Psychology.
When someone calls the NHS to make a complaint, by definition they are unhappy about something. But how the call handler responds can make things worse or begin to make things better. The effect could sound like this.
I've been smashing talking to you.
And you. That's good, that's good.
Smashing mine out. So
oh, lovely, thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Or it could sound like this.
It's a disgrace the way my husband has been treated. And I am not leaving it this time because this is the second time he's been in that ward and the second time he's been treated like a lump of shit.
What is it about the way the call handler responds in these 2 calls that makes such a drastic difference?
Our research investigates the effects of the language choices that the call handlers make. Our data shows that callers and complaint handlers have very different priorities during a complaints call.
What matters to the caller is that they get to tell their story. They want to express the full impact of their experience of what went wrong. That means that these are often long and highly emotional stories.
The call handler, on the other hand, needs to extract all the significant facts from the complaint story and then work out the appropriate next step in the complaints process. But they still have to be sensitive to the highly emotional content of the complaint story that the caller is telling.
This is what makes complaints communication so challenging. The call handler has to be constantly juggling the factual and emotional demands of the call. Drop the factual ball and the complaint won't be properly investigated. Drop the emotional ball and the caller gets more angry, more upset, and the complaint escalates. So how does our research help?
What really matters to callers is that their complaint is properly heard and taken seriously. Our research shows that the way that call handlers can demonstrate that the complaint is being properly heard may be by showing sympathy, but more often is by giving well-timed responses that demonstrate either emotional or factual understanding of what it is the caller is saying.
A complaint handler successfully juggles the demands of complaints communication when they catch the clues from the caller that emotional or factual understanding is expected. Miss a clue and a ball gets dropped and the complaint escalates.
Let's now look at an example where a call handler misses several clues. This particular caller has ended up with a catheter after a minor operation. At the start of the call, his concern is that he wants the problem sorted and the catheter removed. Here's the first ball that the call handler drops.
And they said you have to do what's called a bladder dynamics test. Now, in the meantime, I've still got this catheter. And I've been told that the next time they can do the test is July.
The caller implies that he's unhappy with how long he has to wait for the test. But the aha from the call handler treats the data as just neutral information.
This is what happens next.
I can't put up with this for 2 months. I have applied 2 years ago to work at the London Olympics. I have been accepted for this. I've been working at both. And that's going to screw it all up. I mean, I have not seen a doctor.
The caller doesn't just make his complaint about the timeline more explicit, he also adds another element to his complaint. I have not seen a doctor. The call handler repeatedly misses this particular ball, and we see the effect in the escalation of emotion.
I mean, I came into the week last week and I didn't see a doctor. So I dealt with by nurses. It's just not, it's frightening.
Well, sometimes you do see ENPs, extended nurse practitioners, who are specialised in that.
I'd really like to know what's happening with my body.
The call has now escalated into a complaint in which the caller is a frightened patient feeling very out of control and not being heard by his doctors. But the call handler drops this emotional ball too, and the complaint escalates still further.
I don't want to be living with a catheter for another 2 months. And I didn't come in the hospital with a catheter. I came in, this is the third time I've had an operation. Something happened at the operation that triggered it off, I don't know what.
What started as a practical problem with getting a catheter removed ends up as a highly emotional complaint, encompassing his doctors, the procedure that led to the catheter, his emotional state, and even his prior experiences with the hospital.
So we can see that a complaint escalates with each ball that a complaint handler drops. The value of our research is showing how complaint handlers can communicate to make sure they keep all the balls up in the air, meeting both the needs of the caller and the requirements of their role as complaints handler.
The work that I typically do focuses on how sports crowds support their teams and distract their opponents.
The costume and maybe the song to accompany it.
The concern in these situations tends to be about being heard in these broad social situations involving hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. How do you gain the attention of the people on the field? How do you gain attention of other fans who might want to participate? How do you make sure the people in the back can hear you? So when I see a protest, the researcher part of my brain thinks this is a lot like my sports crowds. So how do they overcome these same practical challenges as the groups that I'm typically looking at? For thousands of years, we had one option for being heard in these situations: talk loud. But as we know, that has its limitations. Like if I say, "Dinner's ready." What? In the time since, we've developed additional technology that can direct our sound waves, or other ideas like acoustics, where we build buildings like music theaters and lecture halls in such a way that sound waves bounce farther, so you don't have to work quite as hard to be heard by the people in the back. We've also developed things we might more recognize as being technology, like speakers, which are basically big voice boxes that talk loud, way louder than we ever could. And even if it's a smaller speaker like the one on your mobile phone, it can at least produce sound closer to the person that you want to be hearing you. Hang on to that idea. not by making a louder noise necessarily, but making a similar noise further away. Here's the thing about acoustics, technology, other things to amplify a voice, they all run on power. And I'm not just talking about the kind that comes in a plug. To build an acoustically sound building typically requires resources beyond what any individual could provide. And then that organization who built the building gets to decide who gets to stand in the space where your voice gets amplified. It's not just that these technologies exist, it's who gets to use them and what do they get to use them for. That brings us to social movements. What do you do when you're protesting against the people who own the buildings, who hold the microphones, who stand on stages, who host the broadcasts? An example of this problem was the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2008, which was a protest against economic inequality after that year's financial crash. Thousands of protesters spent weeks occupying a park near the city's financial district, and there needed to be some way for those thousands of people to have meetings and other communication. You see, the New York City officials were clever. They didn't restrict the protesters' free speech, but they did require permits for any use of what they called amplified sound. I told you these things ran on power. But the protesters were clever too, and they could still use their voices, and they had a lot of them. And so they introduced a mainstream audience to...
Mic check! Mic check! Mic check! Mic check!
The human microphone. Remember that idea I asked you to hang on to, that you didn't have to make a louder noise, you could make a similar noise closer to the people you wanted to hear it? That's how the human microphone works, not by amplifying one person's voice via technology, but one person's voice via everyone else's voices.
The human mic! The human mic! Is you hear one of us talk, you hear one of us talk, you repeat it, and you repeat it, so everybody can hear it, so everybody can hear it.
It sounds simple, right? Just repeat back what I said. But in larger and larger settings, we need waves of repeaters in order for the people in the back to hear us.
We amplify each other's voices.
We amplify each other's voices.
No matter what's said.
No matter what's said.
So we can hear one another.
So we can hear one another.
So there's skill involved on both sides. For the speaker, they need to be able to choose a portion of their speech that's long enough to be engaging and interesting, but short enough that everyone can remember it and repeat it. For the people doing the repeating, they need to listen to this political speech while also preparing their performance of the repeating of it. And for the repeaters of the repeaters, you need to think about which wave of repeaters you're going to be in, because no one's going to make that decision for you. So a simple solution to a practical problem, right? I take my voice, spread it out to the people next to me, they spread it out to people next to them, and that way we distribute the message across the entire crowd. But that's not the only problem that the human microphone solves. It actually solves our original problem, a problem that the most advanced speaker system can't solve. How do you make sure the people in the back can hear you? You can have them tell you that they can hear you, because if they're repeating what you said, it means that they heard it.
If you see,
if you see,
if you see,
if you see
a person
in
the crowd,
inciting violence,
call them out,
call them out,
call them out,
call them out.
So why does this matter? Surely the most important part of the current protests are questions of justice and reform and order and what all those things mean. But as a researcher, I would urge you not to skip over the practical challenges that these current protests are solving. These broader conversations we're having didn't happen by magic. They happened because of the spectacle of millions of people in the streets working together. So it's important to understand that spectacle for the next call for justice, to make sure that those issues get properly raised and don't fizzle out just because a crowd couldn't find its voice.
Good evening, I'm James McCarthy, and I would once again like to welcome you to this evening's discussion on the social power of language. I'm sure after all of those presentations you're filled with questions for our academics, so I will be back in 5 minutes to lead a Q&A session with our panel. If you have any questions that you would like them to answer, be sure to send them our way and I will try my best to get them answered for you. And I will see you again in a few moments. And you're very welcome back to this evening's discussion. And I'm pleased now to say that we are joined live by our panel. We have Tilly Flint, the conversation analyst and PhD researcher at Ulster University. We're also joined by Jack Joyce, a conversation analyst and postdoctoral research associate at Ulster University. Dr. Catherine Rice, senior lecturer and associate head of School of Communications at Ulster University. Dr. Bethan Benwell, senior lecturer in English and linguistics at the University of Stirling. And Dr. Adrian Carrison, lecturer in communication and language at Ulster University. Firstly, I would like to begin. Tilly, perhaps it's best that you answer this first question because it sort of comes from your presentation. But how did you decide which situations and which conversations that you would analyse?
Yeah, so I started my PhD research interested in family conflicts. I'm interested in where conversational communication can go wrong. So I was interested in how these conflicts arise, what happens, how they're resolved. And actually the thing that I became more interested in is the resistance, because that's sort of the day-to-day thing that happens in a lot of families. Not these big arguments, not these massive fallouts between family members, just this resistance between authorities. So that was the thing that I became really interested in. So it started off by just looking at the data and seeing what happened. So looking at how these families interacted with each other, and really being led by what actually happens rather than going in with my own assumptions. And that's generally how this methodology works, is going in with without any idea of what you might find and being led by whatever happens in the data.
Perfect. And when a parent issues a threat to their child, what impact have you found that this has had on their relationship, and how could parents change the way in which they speak to their teenagers in order to balance the power dynamic within their home?
That's a really great question, and something that I'd like to look at further is something more longitudinal, to have a look at what happens throughout these relationships. As it happens for most of the family interactions that I look at, I just have one conversation from this family, so I don't have any history of what happens over the course of 6 months or a year or anything like that. So I just have these one-offs. So as for that first part, I don't know that I can quite answer what happens for the relationship as a whole. But certainly within these single interactions, these teenagers start to resist this parental authority when it's issued in ways such as a threat, which is absolutely the parent asserting their parental authority to tell their children what to do. These teenagers really kick back against that and find other ways of asserting their authority, whether that's through saying what the school says, so bringing in some other external form of authority, whether that, or maybe that's their own authority because they know better about their own homework than their parent does in some cases. Or it might be also talking about other institutions, such as being part of a youth group or part of a church. So they bring in other areas where they might have authority over their parents.
Not a problem. Jack, mansplaining is a stigmatized word. Did you see any of this in your data?
Yeah, definitely. So although in the talk I looked at just the way that the accusation gets made against men, equally how the man responds definitely treats the word as problematic in some way. In fact, generally they do a thing where they kind of accept that a transgression has occurred, so something has gone wrong, but that it wasn't mansplaining. So they deny the fact that mansplaining is a thing, but that they have done something wrong. It's kind of a weird thing. It's quite neat.
Would you say that the dictionary definitions of mansplaining are wrong?
No, I wouldn't say that. In fact, the first way that we found mansplaining to be used by women kind of aligned with what you would consider to be the dictionary definition of mansplaining to be. So although it does align in some senses, there are some ways that the word mansplaining gets used to accuse a man of some transgression that kind of add to that definition or give us insights into how people themselves use the word.
Mm-hmm. And as two men discussing this, could this very conversation be considered mansplaining?
If you accuse me of mansplaining or I accuse you of mansplaining, then definitely.
And the third way of mansplaining that you discussed in your video, the silencing of the man, is that mansplaining in reverse now?
So that's a little bit tricky to unpack, and I think so. The third way was how it silences a man and undermines what the man has been doing, and in this instance, that kind of disrupts all of the talk at that moment to focus everything on this accusation that's being made. So if in our data that was in a political news interview where I think it's a Labour, in fact I showed the clip at the beginning where the Labour MP is talking or correcting what the Conservative MP has said, but then the Conservative MP, Claire Perry, accuses the Labour MP of mansplaining. And so all of the stuff they were talking about in terms of the political opinion, I can't remember exactly what they were talking about, but that all goes out the window, so they have to focus on this accusation of mansplaining. And I guess with mansplaining in reverse, we've seen the term womansplaining come up a little bit, but this is usually used in kind of an ironic sense, and I don't think it has much traction, certainly in the same way that mansplaining does.
No problem. And Bethan, I'm actually going to bring you in on this as well, because you've done some fantastic research in relation to masculinity in the past. But what does mansplaining tell us about sexism and the concept of masculinity?
Okay, so I suppose mansplaining is perceived to be a way of silencing women's voices, perhaps silencing their knowledge and their power in interaction. So I suppose at a kind of microcosmic level, that's an enactment perhaps of the male privilege that is seen to exist in gender structures in society more generally.
Perfect, thank you. And Jack, we have a question in from a member of the audience, and apologies if I pronounce your name wrong, but Beto asks, do you think that the understanding of mansplaining and how it unfolds may change from culture to culture?
Definitely, and I think it's situation and context specific in every single instance of its use. So obviously in our data, we only looked at, so actually we looked at English speaking data and Finnish speaking data of the use of the word mansplaining. But we did think of looking at Spanish and German data, but we never got around to that for the actual paper. But I guess, long story short, definitely, and I'd be super interested in seeing whether that culture or language has an equivalent term or some kind of way of pushing back against similar types of sexism. I think that answers the question.
Thank you. And Catherine, I'm going to come from this one. We have a question in from Mark Alexander, and he asks, do you have cases of complaint escalation when call handlers do something other than minimal tokens or continuers, such as claims of understanding?
That's an interesting question. I'm just desperately scanning our corpus of data to think about that. I think we do. I think we have examples where things like information requests are misplaced. So it's not just minimal responses. We don't have examples, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Beth, and we don't have examples where somebody's kind of expressing sympathy and the call escalates. I mean, we do have examples where calls escalate with sympathy in them, where the sympathy is misplaced. Actually, we do, don't we? We do. The example that we played right at the beginning, which was very cross, does have moments of empathic response, but they're really badly timed, and so they don't work to kind of tone down the escalation. Are there any other examples, Beth? I'm trying to think.
I suppose I'm thinking perhaps of examples where a kind of sort of institutional procedure, within the call handling process is invoked, perhaps, not to kind of adequately respond. So sometimes I think we've got one example where the call handler kind of invokes a position of neutrality to to avoid, perhaps showing a sufficient kind of acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the complaint.
Yes, so then do you think that's reasonable response? Isn't that the one?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
And in terms of your research surrounding NHS complaints, how could call handlers establish the facts of the complaint whilst being sensitive to the emotions and the distress of the complainant?
Do you want to take that, Beth? Or do you...
Sorry, could you just repeat the first part of that?
In terms of your research surrounding NHS complaints, how could call handlers establish the facts of the complaint whilst being sensitive to the emotions and the distress of the complainant?
Okay, I think we've actually got some really good examples of call handlers doing that well, haven't we, Katrin? Where I think call handlers are actually very adept at managing to combine those things. So we've got a really nice example of somebody who's been very distressed, sort of reliving a heart attack experience that he had, and the call handler's very empathic, notably so. It's actually commented on in that first sequence that we played, where he said, "You've got a smashing manner," but then she kind of she marks the kind of turn to gathering informational data by using humour. She talks about his heart attack being like his car breaking down, and he laughs, and then she kind of segues really neatly into a kind of closing sequence where she's getting names and addresses and other information like that.
And Katrin, obviously, arguably these call handlers are going to be placed under even greater strain with the current COVID-19 pandemic, what with procedures being cancelled and waiting lists increasing. Is there any way that the language in which they are using could help alleviate the concerns of complainants with regards to their treatment?
I think the kinds of complaints that they'd be getting are around delays and not getting treatment, but actually, interestingly, that's not unique to now in the period of COVID. One of the things we see when you look at the kind of records of complaints topics, one of the key problems or key things that's complained about, and we see it even in our relatively small pilot corpus, is that delayed treatments, delayed appointments, that comes up over and over again. So it's something that call handlers are already dealing with on a regular basis. It's also a really difficult complaint for call handlers to deal with, because it's very often something that they can't really solve necessarily, because those are institutional timelines that they can't necessarily make any difference with. But what our data shows very clearly is that it's really important that the call handler demonstrates a kind of an empathy and an understanding of the impact of delay on a patient, rather than just treating it as a kind of factual problem to solve. But it's definitely treating it as a human problem really makes a difference.
And while your research focuses on the NHS complaints, could the findings of the research be mirrored in other areas, such as in customer service and in other customer-facing areas where people are having to deal with the complaints procedures?
I think there's a great deal of overlap between these kinds of encounters, and there is research that research in New Zealand and Weatherall and colleagues have looked at sort of customer service encounters in this way. What we find sometimes with those kinds of calls is that there's the sort of burden of sort of empathizing, perhaps seeing it almost as siding with the complainant can be different depending on the circumstances. So obviously, if you're customer service for a commercial company, then you know, that the imperative is to absolutely agree that the customer is right in their complaint. There are other kinds of service encounters which might be more of a kind of sort of mediating service, where there's a sort of professional neutrality that's actually built into the procedure, and they're perhaps a little bit more constrained about the kinds of alignments and affiliations that they can show.
Thank you. And we also have a question in from Emily Hofstadter. Adrian, this one is for yourself. And she asks, could the amplifying voices concept be looked at in reverse as well at systemic practices for constraining voice?
Yes, there's a few different ways that could be relevant, actually. The first is just to say that the practices there aren't perfect. That an example actually that I found from the Occupy Wall Street movement that I was talking about there was a news report of a economist attempted to give a speech about economics through the human microphone, which didn't go very well. That as they said, it's not the best thing for complex concepts, but it's also. Yeah, I think potentially what Emily was asking about is actually some research that I'm just getting started on now in regards to crowds in general, which is the way that the crowds are able to use this range that they develop when they work together to obstruct communication in others. So I haven't looked at protests enough to find that being used, but I would imagine it's the same principles as in sports crowds, which is, as anyone who's been a sports fan knows, there are moments in the game where the crowd is expected to get very loud. And while there's some expectation that's going to inspire their team to succeed, there's also immediate practical constraints that they can put upon their opponents. So if their opponents are attempting to communicate and organize, and suddenly you can't hear anything because the crowd is so loud, now you can't communicate and organize any longer. So there's ways that, along with sort of linking arms and kumbaya and let's boost each other's speech, there are ways that grouping together like this can be used to restrict communication among other groups. So it's just a matter of utilizing that loudness to fight back. And the thing is, it's on all sides, because these protest movements, one of the ways they get broken up is with sound cannons by police departments, where you have these massive speakers on the back of trucks that they direct towards the crowd, so the crowd can't even hear themselves any longer to try to drive them away. So it's funny how sound has become the weapon in these, a peaceful weapon on both sides of these conflicts.
And in terms of the human microphone that was referenced within your presentation, is there a danger that the message could be distorted as it is carried?
I mean, excuse me, there's always the chance. It's like a bit like playing the game of microphone. So if one of the waves of repeaters gets it wrong, suddenly it's not the same message going out across the airwaves, as it were, but a very analog version of the airwaves. So that's part of that key of pacing the speech so that the first group can hear you, and so you get as accurate a repeat as possible. You do find some data out there there's one where someone actually keeps talking for too long, and you get fewer repeaters after that too long, too hard to memorize turn. And not only do you get fewer repeaters, but the ones who do repeat are kind of mumbling as they do it. And so it's not, if the camera wasn't right in front of that person, I don't think I would be able to tell what they were saying.
Thank you very much. And just quickly back to the NHS presentation, we have a comment in from Julianne, who says that she is curious as to how time reference in complaints constructs accountability. If it does, and how attributed is that it chimes with her own research.
Could you say the second half of the question? I missed the second half.
Yeah. So she is curious as to how time reference in complaints constructs accountability, and if it does, how it is attributed.
So there's a really interesting feature of time referencing complaints, which comes from the callers themselves, complainants themselves, they use time in a really interesting way to it's both a way of marking a complaint as formally and officially a complaint. The more precise complainants get about the time of their complaint, the more they kind of mark the complaint as a formal complaint and something that they're very angry with. But they also use time. Beth, and you have a nice kind of notion of the time as a kind of a currency, right?
Oh yeah.
So I was, so they kind of treat time as a kind of good or a currency, and so the patient's time is valuable. So they hold the NHS, the trust, the call handler accountable for the uses of their time as a patient. So how much time they have to wait, how long they're having to wait for an appointment, how long they maybe are waiting in a waiting room, and they use the degrees of detail in their complaint as part of how they assess the quality of the care that they're getting.
Thank you. Tilly, Roisin says that your research is very transferable in terms of people in general being resistant to authority or power when certain language or talk is used, and asks if you would agree.
Definitely. That's one thing that I found doing this research is talking to other people. They recognize it, whether it's with much younger children or whether it's in more institutional settings. People identify with this issue, and it's definitely something that you notice more as you look for it. You see how people orient to authority in different ways, whether it's parental, whether it's institutional, whether it's a hierarchy, whether it's knowledge, the ways that people orient to authority and how they use whichever they orient to as there we go. Sorry about that. As the way of resisting authority.
Thank you for that. And I am conscious that we are coming to the end of our slot. So I will have one final question for you all. And that is, what for you is the most important social power of language? Tilly, if you want to start off for us.
Wow. Okay. That's quite a big one to end on. So certainly for me in my research, it is power in its most literal sense. It's authority. And the way that we use language to either convey and demonstrate that we have that authority or to resist it. So that can be in settings that are everyday, like family interactions, and it can be in other settings, as we've seen a lot recently, politically. So the way that authority is handled is very much through language. So for me, I think the most literal sense of demonstrating authority and resisting it.
And Jack, yourself, what would be the most important social power of language?
I think to reiterate the final point of my talk is that language has immense flexibility, and that we can call out these hidden things that we kind of have a sense of, but we don't have perhaps a name to, and that by putting a name to them, we can make them into speakable and talkable things that we can then call out. So like mansplaining, we can call out that specific sexist behavior because we now have a term to target that very precisely. And I think that's really neat that language can do that. Words.
And Catherine, yourself?
Yeah, so I think the thing that always fascinates me is the way that we use language in every context as a way of showing our understanding of the context. So we display stances to what's going on. We show by how we use language, we're not just communicating messages, we're always communicating how we understand our relationship with the person we're talking to, what we think we're doing at that moment with the person we're talking to. So there's a much kind of bigger picture of meaning getting conveyed at any moment. Every time we speak, we're kind of communicating so holistically about our understanding of the immediate context that we're in.
And Betha?
Okay, so probably in the context of complaints,
the sort of power that language has is perhaps the power to bring about good outcomes and to ensure that everybody's agenda is heard and that people leave the encounter feeling happy. So I suppose there's a power in perhaps understanding how certain language choices have certain consequences, and that's really one of the things that we hope we can actually apply through the study of what we're doing and looking at complaints in this sort of fine-grained way.
And finally, Adrian.
For me, it would be all about participation and what that enables in terms of participation. And something I find fascinating about situations like this with so many people in them, whether it's protest situations or sports that I look at, is how small these situations seem all of a sudden when the communication and the interaction and the participation becomes so focused between everyone that it suddenly starts to act like a one-on-one conversation between maybe an athlete and 10,000 people. And just that ability for inclusion in regards to that suddenly that many people have had this experience of interacting with this other person, of being heard by this other person, I find to be a really, really powerful aspect of how people communicate.
And that brings an end to our webinar and Q&A this evening. On behalf of everyone at Cards of Ulster, I'd like to thank you for tuning in, and I would encourage you to share the link with your friends and family, or indeed anyone who may have wished to join us this evening, but for other reasons couldn't. Until next time, it's goodbye from all of us.